90mm gun, 100mm frontal armor, 42 tons of American heavy metal, 75mm high-velocity gun, 80mm sloped frontal armor, 45 tons of German engineering. Cologne, March 1945. An American M26 Pershing heavy tank encountered a German Panther in the streets of a burning German city. The Pershing destroyed the Panther with a single shot. It was one of the few direct engagements between these two tanks because the Pershing arrived so late in the war that Germany was already collapsing. This is the story of the tank America should have built in 1943 but didn't deploy until 1945. Why the United States refused to develop a heavy tank for 3 years, while American crews died in inadequate Shermans. And what happened when America's answer to the Panther finally reached the battlefield, 18 months too late to save thousands of lives. The decision to delay American heavy tank development was not made by engineers who didn't understand the problem, or by field commanders who didn't see the need. It was made by senior American military leadership who fundamentally misunderstood the nature of armored warfare and prioritized the wrong capabilities. As early as mid-1942, American tank designers and Ordnance Department engineers recognized that the M4 Sherman would be inadequate against improved German armor that was certain to appear. Preliminary designs for heavier American tanks with thicker armor and more powerful guns existed before the first Sherman even entered combat. The technical capability to build a tank superior to the Sherman was never in question. What was in question was whether American military doctrine required such a tank, and senior leaders repeatedly answered that question incorrectly until battlefield casualties forced a policy change that came far too late. General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces and one of the most influential voices in American armor policy, believed passionately that tanks should not fight other tanks. McNair's doctrine held that tanks were exploitation weapons meant to break through enemy lines and attack rear areas, supply lines, and headquarters. Enemy tanks would be destroyed by dedicated tank destroyers, fast, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns designed specifically for anti-tank combat. This division of labor made sense in theory and allowed each vehicle type to be optimized for its specific role. Tanks could prioritize mobility and reliability over armor and anti-tank firepower. Tank destroyers could mount heavy guns without the weight penalty of thick armor. The problem was that this doctrine collapsed immediately upon contact with German tactical reality. German forces did not cooperate by allowing American tanks to bypass their armor and attack rear areas. German tanks, especially Panthers and Tigers, blocked American advances and forced American tank units into direct combat, whether American doctrine wanted it or not. The institutional resistance to heavy tank development was reinforced by legitimate concerns about production capacity, shipping limitations, and the American emphasis on mechanical reliability. American military planners correctly recognized that building a heavier tank would reduce production rates because heavier vehicles required more raw materials, more manufacturing time, and more complex components. Shipping a heavier tank across the Atlantic required more cargo space, meaning fewer tanks could be transported per convoy. The American logistics system that supplied forces in Europe was optimized for the Sherman's weight and dimensions. Introducing a significantly heavier tank would require modifications to ships, landing craft, transporters, bridges, and repair facilities. These were legitimate concerns, but they were solvable problems that could have been addressed with industrial effort and planning. What was not solvable was sending American tank crews into combat against Panthers and Tigers in tanks that could not fight back effectively. The decision to prioritize logistics convenience over crew survivability was a choice that cost thousands of American lives. The breaking point came in Normandy in summer 1944, when American tank units encountered Panthers in significant numbers for the first time and suffered catastrophic losses. American tank commanders sent desperate reports to higher headquarters, explaining that Sherman 75mm guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at any combat range, while Panther guns could destroy Shermans from over 1,000 meters. Experienced crews were being killed in numbers that shocked even hardened combat veterans. Tank replacement crews arriving in Normandy had life expectancies measured in days, sometimes hours. The reports from Normandy finally convinced senior American leadership that the tank destroyer doctrine had failed, and that American forces needed a tank capable of fighting German heavy armor on equal terms. But by the time this decision was made in mid-1944, it was already too late. Even expedited development and production of a new heavy tank could not field significant numbers before Germany collapsed. Development of what became the M26 Pershing had actually begun in early 1942 under the designation T-20, but the project had been repeatedly delayed, defunded, and deprioritized by the same senior leadership that insisted the Sherman was adequate and that tank destroyers would handle German armor. Engineers worked on improved designs throughout 1942 and 1943 despite lack of official support, creating progressively better prototypes designated T-20, T-22, T-23, T-25, and finally T-26. Each iteration incorporated lessons from combat reports and improved armor, firepower, and mobility. The T-26 design that emerged in 1944 was finally approved for production as the M26 heavy tank and later reclassified as the M26 medium tank when it became clear that at 42 tons, it was barely heavier than the Panther at 45 tons. The first production M26s rolled off assembly lines in November 1944, more than 2 years after the design had been proven feasible. The delay had been entirely administrative and doctrinal, not technical. The M26 Pershing, that finally reached Europe in early 1945, was exactly what American tank crews had needed in 1943. The tank mounted a 90mm M3 gun that could penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges and had adequate performance against Tiger armor from the front at closer ranges. The frontal armor was 100mm thick on the hull and 102mm on the turret, both sloped at angles that increased effective protection significantly. This armor could defeat Panther guns at medium ranges and provided dramatically better crew survivability than the Sherman's 51mm hull armor. The weight of 42 tons was manageable, with the Ford GAF V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, giving adequate mobility, though not matching the Sherman's speed. The crew of 5 had a spacious, well-designed fighting compartment with excellent vision devices and ergonomics, far superior to cramped German tank interiors. In every measurable category except production numbers and time in service, the M26 was superior to the Sherman and roughly equal to the Panther. But superior performance in March 1945 could not compensate for absence in June 1944, when it was desperately needed. By early 1945, when M26 Pershings began arriving in small numbers, the Panther that had terrorized Allied tank crews in 1944 was no longer the dominant threat it had been during the Normandy campaign. Not because the Panther had become less capable, the tank's technical specifications remained formidable, but because the strategic situation had deteriorated so catastrophically for Germany that even superior tanks could not compensate for fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, crew quality decline, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The Panther, that American Pershing crews might have faced in early 1945, was often crewed by inadequately trained replacements, running on minimal fuel reserves, low on ammunition, and operating without the infantry and artillery support that had made Panthers so deadly in defensive operations. Understanding the Panther's decline is essential to understanding why the Pershing versus Panther matchup that should have defined late-war armored combat instead became a footnote to a war already decided. The Panther's mechanical reliability problems, that had plagued the tank since its rushed combat debut at Kursk in July 1943 had improved somewhat by 1944, but never reached acceptable standards. German engineers continuously refined the transmission, final drives, and suspension components throughout production, and later Panther variants were significantly more reliable than early models. Panther AUSFG tanks, produced in 1944 and early 1945, incorporated hundreds of small improvements that reduced breakdown rates and simplified maintenance. However, these improvements came too late and in insufficient numbers to overcome the fundamental problem that the Panther's 45-ton weight stressed mechanical components designed with inadequate safety margins. Even improved Panthers spent extensive time in maintenance, required skilled mechanics and specialized tools for major repairs, and broke down with regularity that would have been unacceptable for American or Soviet tank forces. By early 1945, the breakdown problem was compounded by parts shortages as Allied bombing disrupted German supply chains and destroyed parts manufacturing facilities. German crew quality for Panthers declined precipitously between mid-1944 and early 1945, as experienced panzer crews were killed in the fighting retreat across France and replaced with hastily trained recruits who had received minimal instruction due to fuel shortages that limited training. The veteran Panther crews who had achieved impressive kill ratios in Normandy understood their tank's strengths and limitations intimately, knew how to position for maximum advantage, and had the gunnery skills to achieve first-round hits at long range. These veterans were progressively killed, wounded, or captured as German forces retreated, and their replacements often had only weeks of training compared to the months or years of experience the veterans had accumulated. By the time Pershings arrived, many Panther crews were teenagers, with minimal training operating complex vehicles they barely understood. The crew quality advantage that had made Panthers so deadly in 1944 had largely evaporated by early 1945. The fuel situation was catastrophic for German armored operations by 1945 and affected Panthers as severely as it affected all German vehicles. The Panther consumed approximately 300 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers under normal operations and significantly more in combat. German fuel production had collapsed under Allied bombing, and the loss of Romanian oil fields to Soviet advances had eliminated Germany's primary petroleum source. Panther units in early 1945 often had only enough fuel for short tactical movements and could not conduct the kind of mobile operations that had characterized earlier German armor doctrine. Many Panthers were positioned in static defensive positions, not by tactical choice, but because there was insufficient fuel to move them. Some Panthers were abandoned in working order, when their units retreated simply because there was no fuel to drive them to new positions. The fuel crisis meant that even mechanically functional Panthers with well-trained crews were often immobilized and vulnerable to being bypassed or destroyed by artillery and infantry rather than defeated in tank combat. Ammunition shortages compounded the fuel problem and reduced Panther effectiveness dramatically. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun was only effective when supplied with adequate ammunition of the correct types for different targets. Armor-piercing rounds were needed for enemy tanks, high explosive for infantry and fortifications, and specialized ammunition for different tactical situations. By early 1945, German logistics could barely supply basic ammunition loads, and Panthers often went into combat with reduced ammunition and sometimes without proper armor-piercing rounds. Panther crews learned to husband their limited ammunition carefully, taking only high-probability shots and avoiding extended engagements that would exhaust their load. Some Panthers in defensive positions in Germany in 1945 had as few as 10 to 20 main gun rounds available, compared to the normal combat load of 79 rounds. A tank with limited ammunition cannot be employed aggressively and becomes a static defensive position rather than a mobile weapon. The tactical employment of Panthers by early 1945 had shifted from the mobile defensive operations that characterized their use in France to desperate static defense of German territory with minimal support. Panthers in France in 1944 had operated with extensive infantry support, artillery coordination, and air cover that multiplied their effectiveness. Panthers positioned in ambush with infantry protecting their flanks and artillery suppressing enemy advances could achieve the impressive kill ratios that made them so feared. Panthers in Germany in 1945 often fought without adequate infantry support, as German ground forces were stretched impossibly thin, without artillery support as ammunition shortages affected all weapon systems, and without any air cover, as the Luftwaffe had been destroyed, and Allied air superiority was absolute. A Panther operating alone or with minimal support was vulnerable to being flanked by infantry, targeted by artillery, and attacked by aircraft, in ways that combined arms support would have prevented. The degradation of German combined arms capability made even technically superior Panthers far less effective than they had been when properly supported. The first M26 Pershings arrived in Europe in January 1945 as part of a limited deployment to assess the new tank's performance under combat conditions. Only 20 Pershings were initially sent, assigned to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, a tiny number compared to the thousands of Shermans still equipping American armored units. The limited deployment reflected continued uncertainty among American leadership about whether the Pershing was necessary, given that Germany was clearly losing the war and the Sherman, despite its limitations, was winning through numerical superiority. The Pershing crews, who received the new tanks, were experienced veterans selected specifically for the test deployment, men who understood both the Sherman's weaknesses and the tactical requirements for fighting German heavy armor. These crews would provide the only real data on how the Pershing performed against Panthers and other German tanks in actual combat, rather than theoretical analysis. The most famous Pershing versus Panther engagement occurred in Cologne on March 6, 1945, and was captured on film by an American combat cameraman, providing one of the few documented visual records of American and German heavy tanks in direct combat. A Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division was advancing through the streets of Cologne when it encountered a Panther positioned in a defensive position covering a key intersection. The Panther crew spotted the Pershing and fired first, the round hitting the Pershing's frontal armor, but failing to penetrate due to the thick armor and angled plate that characterized the Pershing's design. The Pershing crew returned fire immediately, their 90mm armor-piercing round penetrating the Panther's frontal armor and destroying the German tank with a single shot. The engagement lasted only seconds, but demonstrated exactly what American tank crews had needed for 18 months. A tank that could survive hits from German guns and destroy German armor with return fire. The film of this engagement was widely distributed and used in American training and propaganda, finally providing visual proof that American heavy armor could defeat German tanks in direct combat. The Cologne engagement validated the Pershing's design and demonstrated that American industry could build a tank competitive with German heavy armor when leadership priorities allowed it. But the engagement also highlighted the tragedy of the delayed deployment. The Pershing that destroyed the Panther in Cologne in March 1945 could have been deployed in Normandy in June 1944 if development and production had been prioritized. Thousands of American tank crew casualties in France, Belgium, and Germany during 1944 might have been prevented if Pershings had been available. The crews who died in Shermans facing Panthers they could not defeat had needed exactly what the Pershing provided. But institutional resistance and doctrinal rigidity had denied them that capability until the war was nearly over. The Cologne engagement was simultaneously a triumph of American engineering and a condemnation of the leadership decisions that delayed that engineering achievement until it barely mattered strategically. The Pershing's technical comparison with the Panther revealed a tank that was roughly equal in most categories and superior in some. The 90mm M3 gun could penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges, finally giving American crews the ability to engage Panthers frontally rather than requiring desperate flanking maneuvers under fire. The Pershing's frontal armor could defeat Panther guns at medium ranges, providing crew survivability that the Sherman completely lacked. The Pershing's crew compartment was spacious and well-designed, superior to the Panther's cramped interior, where crew members were squeezed together in ways that impaired efficiency. The Pershing's vision devices and ergonomics were excellent, reflecting American attention to crew comfort and effectiveness. The mechanical reliability was good by American standards, and far superior to the Panther's troubled transmission and final drives. In mobility, the Panther had advantages with better speed and cross-country performance due to its more powerful engine, but the Pershing's mobility was adequate for the defensive operations and urban combat that characterized fighting in Germany in 1945. American tactical doctrine for employing Pershings reflected the limited numbers available and the desire to preserve the scarce heavy tanks for critical engagements. Pershings were not distributed broadly across armored units, but concentrated in specific companies that would spearhead attacks against known German armor concentrations. Sherman units would fix German positions and develop the tactical situation, while Pershing platoons would be called forward to engage Panthers, Tigers, or other heavy armor that Shermans could not defeat. This conservative employment reflected the reality that with only a few dozen Pershings available in early 1945, losses could not be quickly replaced. Every Pershing destroyed meant one less heavy tank available for future critical engagements. American commanders learned to employ Pershings carefully, using them when necessary, but preserving them when possible. This was the exact opposite of Sherman doctrine, where high casualties were accepted because replacement tanks were always available. The Pershing's combat record in the final months of World War II in Europe was limited by the small numbers deployed and the rapidly deteriorating German military situation. Pershings engaged Panthers in several documented encounters and consistently performed well, destroying German tanks while surviving return fire that would have destroyed Shermans. But these engagements were relatively rare, because by March and April 1945, German armored resistance was collapsing, as fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority made sustained resistance impossible. Many German tanks were found abandoned rather than destroyed in combat. Pershings spent more time supporting infantry attacks against fortified positions, using their 90mm guns to destroy German strongpoints, than fighting tank versus tank battles. The Pershing proved effective in this infantry support role, but it was a role that could have been performed by properly supported Shermans. The unique capability that justified the Pershing, the ability to defeat German heavy armor, was needed most in 1944 when it was absent, not in 1945 when German resistance was collapsing. The M26 Pershing versus Panther comparison is ultimately a story about institutional failure rather than technical capability. The Pershing demonstrated that American industry could build a tank equal to or superior to German heavy armor when allowed to do so. The technical challenges were solvable and were in fact solved, producing a tank that performed well in the limited combat it saw. But the Pershing also demonstrated that technical capability means nothing when institutional resistance and doctrinal rigidity prevent that capability from being deployed when it is needed most. The thousands of American tank crew casualties in 1944 who died in Shermans facing Panthers and Tigers they could not defeat are the cost of the decision to delay the Pershing. No amount of technical excellence in 1945 could compensate for absence in 1944. The direct technical comparison between the Pershing and Panther shows two tanks that were roughly comparable and would have been evenly matched if deployed in equal numbers with equal support. The Panther's advantages were primarily in mobility, better speed, better cross-country performance, and better power-to-weight ratio due to the more powerful Maybach engine. The Pershing's advantages were primarily in crew efficiency, better ergonomics, better vision devices, better crew compartment design, and significantly better mechanical reliability. In firepower and armor protection, the tanks were roughly equal, with each having slight advantages in specific categories. A Pershing versus Panther engagement would likely be decided by crew quality, tactical positioning, first-shot accuracy, and supporting elements rather than inherent vehicle superiority. This parity is exactly what American forces needed. Not a tank vastly superior to German armor, but a tank competitive enough that American numerical superiority and industrial capacity could be decisive. The production comparison reveals the tragic waste of American industrial potential. The United States eventually built approximately 2,200 M26 Pershings, most after World War II ended. If Pershing production had been authorized in early 1943 when the design was proven feasible, American industry could have produced 10,000 or more Pershings by the end of 1944, completely replacing the Sherman in frontline units and giving American armored forces overwhelming superiority over German armor. American production capacity was never the limitation. American factories were simultaneously building tens of thousands of trucks, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, and millions of weapons while still operating below maximum capacity. The limitation was the decision not to prioritize heavy tank production until it was too late to matter. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers despite having its industry devastated by bombing and having to distribute production across multiple essential weapon systems. The United States could have built 3 or 4 Pershings for every Panther Germany produced if leadership had recognized the need and committed resources appropriately. The crew survivability comparison between Pershing and Sherman highlights the human cost of the delayed deployment. Pershings had dramatically better crew survivability than Shermans due to thicker armor, better armor angles, and improved internal design that reduced catastrophic fires. When a Pershing was hit by German anti-tank fire, crew members had significantly better chances of surviving than Sherman crews facing the same weapons. Every month that Pershings were delayed in favor of continued Sherman production was a month where American tank crews died in numbers that could have been reduced if better equipment had been available. The exact casualty figures are impossible to calculate, but estimates suggest thousands of American tank crew deaths in 1944 might have been prevented if Pershings had been deployed when first available, rather than 18 months late. The post-war legacy of the Pershing vindicated the tank's design and condemned the decisions that delayed it. The M26 became the basis for American tank development in the late 1940s and early 1950s, evolving into the M46, M47, and eventually the M48 Patton series that served through the Korean War and beyond. The Pershing's basic design, heavy firepower, heavy armor, good mobility, and excellent crew efficiency became the template for American main battle tanks for decades. The institutional lessons were also learned, at least temporarily. Post-war American armor doctrine abandoned the tank destroyer concept and recognized that tanks must be capable of fighting other tanks rather than relying on specialized vehicles for anti-tank combat. The Korean War demonstrated the value of these lessons when American M26 Pershings and M46 Pattons proved superior to North Korean T-34/85s, showing that the Pershing design remained competitive years after World War II ended. The final verdict on Pershing versus Panther is that the Pershing was a capable tank that arrived too late to fulfill its primary mission, but validated the principle that American industry could build heavy armor competitive with any nation when institutional priorities allowed it. The Panther, by early 1945, was a capable tank operating in catastrophic circumstances that prevented it from achieving its potential. Both tanks demonstrated that technical capability, without strategic context, means little. The Panther's superiority in 1944 could not prevent German defeat, because Germany lacked the industrial capacity, fuel supplies, and manpower to sustain operations regardless of tank quality. The Pershing's capability in 1945 mattered little, because Germany was already defeated, and the battles where the Pershing would have been most valuable had already been fought without it. The lesson is not about which tank was better in abstract technical terms, but about the importance of deploying adequate equipment when it is needed, rather than when it is convenient, or when institutional resistance has finally been overcome. Subscribe for more daily World War II tank comparisons and analysis of armor development. Comment below. Should the United States have deployed the Pershing in 1943, or was the Sherman adequate for American strategic needs? The debate about heavy tank doctrine continues.